Bullies, the quiet student who turns silence into strength. Quincy Hale moved through Roosevelt High with the careful, almost ceremonial ease of someone who had learned long ago that attention was a trap you could step around, a seat you could never sit in without feeling the weight of a dozen eyes. And so he kept his head tilted just enough to study the floor tiles, counted footsteps between classrooms, and let the noise wash over him like rain against a shielded window. He was tall and slender, a frame that seemed to bend around the world rather than meet it head-on, with skin that carried the quiet glow of dusk and eyes that missed most of the drama unless it pressed close enough to bruise. His hair was a coils and crebs of tight curls that lay against his scalp, not messy, but always pulled into place by a routine brush he observed like a ritual, a way to remind himself that some things could be controlled with a patient hand. He wore simple clothes, muted blues and greys that matched the afternoon light in the hall, sneakers scuffed from years of steady, repetitive use, and the sort of backpack that carried more notebooks than most people carried opinions. The true weight on his shoulders was not the heft of textbooks, but the quiet calculus of a life spent listening rather than choosing, the habit of letting others steer the ship while he kept the sails in order. Quincy's secret strength rested in a discipline no one guessed and certainly no one whispered about in the bleachers or the lunchroom. A precise, almost musical mastery of taekwondo he had learned in a cousin's tiny basement dojo and then cultivated in off-the-book late-night drills, the kind of training that could morph a body's reflexes into a split-second defense and a calm, unshakable breath in the middle of chaos. The skill hid behind his posture, behind the soft words he spoke to teachers, behind the careful way he navigated the cafeteria line or the crowded bus after practice, and in the way he could silence the tremor of fear by turning fear into focus. He practiced the forms in his head during a long car ride home, counted kicks and stances like a musician counting measures, and when he found a spare moment, he would run through them in the quiet of his bedroom, the window cracked to let in the city's hum, as if the city itself was a watching audience, waiting to see if the quiet boy could ever become something else. Roosevelt High was no stranger to strain, though the term never left the glossy brochures. It wore the walls in the cafeteria's stainless walls, the gym's echoing floor, and the library's humming fluorescent lights. It had been a few years since Quincy had first learned to breathe through the day's small avalanches, the way a hallway can crash into you with a whisper of judgment, the way a locker door can slam shut on a person's dignity, the way a group of kids can decide your silence is an invitation to test how loud they can be. The school layout formed a map he had learned to memorize by heart. The cafeteria's long steel tables where meals smelled of cinnamon and steam, the library's quiet stairwell where the marble steps held the fingerprints of many late-night readers, the science wing where the hum of refrigerators and vacuum tubes gave a sense of a living, blinking thing behind every corridor, the gym where the bleachers groaned like an old ship. It was a place that could either be a sanctuary or a stage for cruelty, and on most days Quincy moved as if the building were a friend to lean on rather than an arena to survive. The bullies had names that sounded almost like a chorus you would hear in a melodrama rather than in a high school hallway. Cade Holloway, the leader, with a jaw set as if he had rehearsed every sneer in a dictionary of contempt. Milo Reed, tall and lean with a sly smile that never reached his eyes. And Trent Bell, stocky and loud, the noisemaker who believed volume equaled control. They wore the air of people used to getting their way, a small, sharp cluster of egos who could shine a spotlight on someone else's flaws and watch them stutter under it. They chose Quincy because he didn't react, because he did not escalate, because he did not turn his head to meet their eyes with a challenge or a retort. They made him the baseline of their power, a quiet target in the hallway, a whispered joke in the cafeteria line, a book knocked from his hands in the library stairwell. Their first real encounter came early, On a Tuesday that began with the predictable clatter of lunch trays and ended with a rumor that traveled faster than the hall's crowd, Quincy had not laughed at a joke that required a cruel permission to mock someone else, and that somehow was an invitation to discipline him for it. He stood by a row of lockers near the science wing while the bell's echo faded, listening to the soft, casual cruelty of their voices, the kind that speaks in partial truths and thinly veiled threats, enough to sting without leaving a mark, enough to force a quiet withdrawal so that others would look away rather than meet the problem head-on. The first interaction was not a blow, but a performance. Cade stepped close and far enough to invade not his space so much as his sense of safety, and Milo built a wall of laughter with Trent's loud agreement as if Quincy were a piece of furniture that needed rearranging. The words weren't new to Quincy. The taunts felt like the same weather system, predictable and cold, yet they carried a weight that pinched at his breath and shifted his stance just a fraction toward retreat. Quincy did not fight back in the moment. He moved away with the quiet speed of someone who had practiced the art of dissolving into the background, the way a pianist can drop a hand from a chord and vanish before the orchestra misses the missing note. The humiliation came in a dozen small actions. The spray of water from a spill that wasn't quite spilled on his shirt during lunch, the snickering that rose as his backpack's zippers got stuck, the way someone tripped a corner of his notebook and it slid across the floor with a crisp, mocking sound, the way someone shouted a name he never used, a caricature of a nickname designed to reduce him to a label rather than a person. Each incident felt like a pressure wave, gently at first, then swelling, then a crescendo that demanded a reaction he did not permit himself to give, because to retaliate would be to risk something he could not afford to lose. As days turned to weeks, a pattern emerged. The bullies tested the borders of his quiet again and again, and Quincy found new corridors to slip through, new exits to reach his class in time, new angles to approach the door away from the crowd. He carried the sense that he was a draft in a storm, always moving just enough to avoid being pressed flat, never turning to confront the wind that threatened to tear him apart. In the library stairwell, he would pause to breathe, counting to 10 and letting the world slow down around him. In the cafeteria, he would watch the yellow glow of the ceiling lights reflect off the metal of his tray and pretend the surface was a lake, the clamor around him merely ripples rather than waves. The bully's drama became predictable too. A joke, a shove, a spill, a demand for silence, and the quiet boy obliged by keeping quiet, by stepping away, by letting the hallway swallow the sound of his own heartbeat in a way that did not betray fear, but kept his fear small enough to hide, a quiet reservoir of strength he refused to use in a way that would harm others. In the middle of the term, something shifted in a way no one could have predicted. The major humiliation came one afternoon in a place Quincy used to think of as a sanctuary, the school theater where Kai Donovan kept watch over the stage's quiet magic, where the lights burned a pale, hopeful gold, and the air always smelled faintly of spray paint and old coffee and possibility. Kai was a senior who wore a soft confidence like a jacket that fit perfectly, someone who could make the stage lights feel like a warm embrace and the audience feel seen, even in a crowd. The theatre club planned a display of student voices, a reading of poems, a night when the room would tilt toward vulnerability and show what fear looked like when it chose to be brave. Kai had invited Quincy to the back of the auditorium after rehearsal, asking him to run a sound check on a microphone that didn't quite like his voice, to test the balance between stage and audience, between a whispered confession and a shout for help. It was supposed to be a quiet moment, a chance to trust a friend with something a little personal. Instead, it became a spectacle, a moment in which Cade Holloway and his allies decided to crash Kai's world as a way to prove their dominance over both the club and the quiet student who had never stepped into their visible circle. The day of the humiliating event was a string of ordinary gears grinding against one another until the edges were so sharp you could slice bread with the silence that followed. The bullies arrived early. The theatre doors barely closed when the trio began a chorus of small, painful jabs that grew louder as Kai moved toward the microphone to begin his piece. The room's mood darkened in a way that made the projector's hum seem like a thunderstorm outside a window. Kai's poem spoke of resilience, of a night sky that never quite gives up its stars, of a girl who stood at the edge of her own fear and leaped anyway. And as Kai read, a few students lowered their eyes, a few slouched and a few looked away, in that way that suggests you're not supposed to witness what hurts you, not supposed to step in. The bullies seized on the moment to escalate with a cruel formality. A camera phone flashed, a whispered rumor among the front rows about a sensitive line Kai supposedly would not perform aloud, and then a hand reached out to tug at Kai's sleeve, pulling them from the microphone with a mock concern that felt like a blade. The crowd's laughter rose, not thunderous, but enough to ripple through the room and turn Kai's cheeks from a soft blush to the bright color of a flame. It was not a blow in the physical sense, but it was a rupture of trust, a forced exposure of vulnerability in front of peers who had the power to turn a moment of dream-making into a moment of ridicule. In that moment, Quincy's chest ached, as if a weight had dropped into his lungs. But something inside him also learned to inhale more deliberately, to hold the breath long enough to hear the room's sudden quiet fall away into a murmur of sympathy that he could not quite name. The crowd's shift did not come from belief in Quincy's courage, but from a cascade of smaller observations whispered through the rows. A shoulder that rose slightly higher in the seat of a friend who had watched Quincy slip away from the scene earlier. A teacher's glances that lingered a second too long on the boy who never asked for more. A student who caught the corners of a glance and thought, maybe he's not what they say. A few people offered quiet smiles, or a whispered, "You got this," after the show of cruelty that Kai endured. One teacher, Ms. Rivera, paused to request a backstage check, but the moment passed, with the theater door shutting and the room sliding back into ordinary life. The impression that something was changing began as a subtle tremor in Quincy's posture, a hush in his walk that did not indicate fear's retreat, but the birth of a more deliberate presence. Even the bullies began to sense a shift. They did not yet fear him, but they felt a thread pulled out of their control, a string that would soon tighten if tugged again. The preparation for what would come next was quiet and intense. Quincy began to train, not by punching a bag in a shadowed gym after hours, but by turning the training into a mental architecture for action. He rehearsed moments of confrontation in the mind's theater, not to provoke violence, but to shorten the distance between threat and response. He adjusted his posture in the hallway mirrors, straightened his spine, and let the breath move through his chest in longer, calmer cycles. He built a rhythm for himself, a tempo of readiness that matched the tempo of the day's routine. He learned to read the body language of others with better accuracy, the way shoulders tilt, how a foot taps, where eyes flicker when a lie is told. A few students began to notice that Quincy carried a different timing now. His steps landed with a sense of purpose. His eyes held a soft, controlled glare rather than the dull glaze of fear. Among them was Kai, who during a late study session in the library noticed how Quincy's hands rested on the chair back with a quiet, almost protective steadiness, how his breath slowed when he passed the science wing, how his mouth opened to speak and then closed, as if he chose words more carefully now because he wanted others to hear his truth rather than the noise of their inability to listen. Kai asked about the new calm, and Quincy simply said, in a line that sounded almost borrowed from a movie about heroes, that it wasn't new courage so much as earned resolve, the result of choosing not to let someone else's cruelty define his day. The climactic confrontation arrived with the inevitability of a storm that refuses to pass by without a strike of lightning. It happened after football practice, near the bleachers where a crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the idea of a spectacle rather than the need for safety. Cade, Milo and Trent found Kai again, this time near the stadium's semi-dark corridor that led to the gym's fire exit. They needed to feel bigger, to erase the room's memory of the previous night's kindness toward Kai's talent, and they sought to finish what they had started by making Kai's hope feel ridiculous in front of everyone. They cornered the pair. Kai's notebook, filled with lines and doodles that captured a soul's quiet defiance, lay at their feet, and Kai stood with their chin up, a look of steady resolve that betrayed the fear in their eyes. The bullies moved closer, their voices dropping to a hiss that was supposed to frighten, to threaten, to remind everyone who controlled the room. But in that moment, Quincy did not remain silent or fade away. He stepped into the fringe of the corridor's light, the air around him seeming to hold steady, as if time decided to math itself in his favor. He spoke not to the crowd, but to the three, a measured cadence that surprised even him, a calm so controlled that the room's noise paused in mid-breath, as if listening to a single deliberate note. His secret strength emerged not only as a physical test, but as a discipline of presence. He raised a hand toward them, not to strike, but to block, and to anchor his own stance with a thin, unyielding line of confidence. The audience, the other students who watched the scene from the cluttered edges of the football field, from the gym's entrance, from the library's far windows, felt the shift in the air. Quincy's eyes found Kai's, and in that brief moment, the danger among the bullies crystallized into something the onlookers could only label as awe. A boy who had spent his life being looked through, who had learned to listen to the right signals from his own body and from the world around him, now turning those signals into action. He used a sequence of controlled, precise kicks learned from years of quiet practice, not to injure, but to disarm and to create a path out of danger. A swift block prevented a shove toward Kai. A measured step removed the aggressor from the space. A gentle, deliberate sweep sent Milo tumbling into a stack of practice mats. The movement was careful, almost choreographed, but it was also honest. The kind of honest that can exist only when a person has practiced a lifetime's worth of restraint and uses it at the exact moment it is needed. The fear around the bullies dissolved into a grudging respect as the confrontation unfolded. Bystanders gasped at the sudden, almost choreographed violence, and then exhaled when the blows did not escalate into something catastrophic. The crowd, once eager to watch a cruelty show, now watched a young boy who did not seek the crowd's approval, but who refused to surrender his own safety or the safety of Kai, who stood with their back pressed to a locker, their notebook clutched to their chest as if it were a shield made of paper and ink. The bullies, frankly shocked by what they misread as a fragile target, found themselves outmatched not by brute force alone, but by a countervailing calm. The finishing moment did not come as a brutal end, but as a quiet reclaiming of the space. Quincy paused with gravity in his step, looked into Cade's eyes with something like distant pity, and then, with the authority of someone who had learned to breathe before acting, offered a word, a boundary and a choice. Let this end now, or it ends the hard way. He did not deliver a brutal final strike, but he did deliver a decisive takedown that incapacitated the aura of invincibility around Cade and left him on the floor with a breathless, astonished look that said he could no longer command fear as if it were a commodity. The room's dynamic changed in the wake of the fight. A hush settled over the bleachers and the hallway outside the theater, followed by a chorus of whispers that felt like confession rather than judgment. Some students murmured about how Quincy's posture had shifted in the last weeks, how he now carried his shoulders back with a quiet power, how his voice, when he spoke to others, carried weight, how his eyes no longer skipped away from trouble, but settled on it with a steady, measurable intention. The bully's bravado broke in the aftermath. Cade's sneers lost their magnetism. Milo's confident half-smiles faded. Trent's loud voice now carried an edge of uncertainty. The admiration and fear that had braided through the school's corridors loosened. A new respect began to take root. Not as fear of punishment, but as the recognition of a different kind of strength. One that is quiet, disciplined, and oriented toward protecting others as much as defending oneself. Kai's awe became something more tangible in the days that followed. They continued to be a target in the sense that the bullies tried again to humiliate them, but this time the attempt failed to generate the crowd's laughter because the room carried a new memory. The image of Quincy stepping forward, not as a bully's echo, but as a shield and a steady hand. Kai found a renewed courage too, and the bond between Quincy and Kai grew into something more resilient than a crush or a casual connection. It became a partnership with a shared sense of risk and a mutual vow to protect what mattered, a promise spoken without words but understood in the way Kai glanced at Quincy with a soft trust and the way Quincy answered with a slow, certain smile. The romance was not loud and showy, but present in the way they checked in on each other during lunch, in the way Kai drew a quiet portrait of resilience and left it for Quincy to discover in the art room, in the way Quincy offered Kai a hand when the world became too heavy for Kai's shoulders. In the weeks that followed, Roosevelt High changed its atmosphere with a slow, almost patient evolution. The administration, which had rushed to address the last incident with a promise of more intervention, found itself facing a different problem. The school's culture needed a new architecture, a design that prioritized accountability, empathy, and the rebuilding of trust between students and staff. Some teachers began to intervene more consistently, particularly those who had observed the way a quiet student could absorb the room's cruelty and still stand, not with the bravado of a hero, but with the dignity of someone who knows what justice feels like when it is earned. Others remained passive or overwhelmed, their inaction a reminder of the challenges of changing a social ecosystem that had long relied on silence as a form of compliance. The bullies, for their part, faced a new reality. The quiet boy who never asked for trouble had taught them a lesson they could not ignore without losing their own sense of control, and the humiliations that had once felt like entertainment now felt like a mirror. The moral of the story, standing up for oneself without losing one's soul, grew in the hearts of the school's students like ivy along a brick wall. Quincy's reputation did not morph into a reckless display of power. It matured into something steadier, a quiet, almost ceremonial insistence that one's voice could carry weight without having to shout, that restraint could be a weapon, and that courage could be gentle and protective rather than cruel. The new dynamic elevated not only Quincy, but those who had doubted him for years, including a few classmates who, in their private corners, admitted their complicity in letting cruelty flourish by not saying anything, not stepping in, not believing that someone like Quincy could matter as more than a thing to be mocked. They began to see that the true measure of strength was not the ability to crush an opponent, but the discipline to walk away from the edge while leaving space for others to walk with you, to stand with you, to grow with you. And in the process, a circle formed. Kai's art show receipts now carried Quincy's name beside a signature that had become a pledge. A group of students who had once laughed only at their own cleverness, now using their voices to defend someone else's dignity. And a school that finally felt like a place where people could be both fierce and kind without contradiction. The story ends with Quincy reflecting on the transformation that a single day, and the days that followed, could coax from a person who had learned to be silent when violence lurked, but who also learned that silence, when chosen, can be the loudest voice of all. The hallways no longer seemed to shrink him. Instead, They opened like a theater of possibilities, and the people within those halls began to see him not as a shadow, but as someone who had learned to hold the stage without needing the spotlight to prove his worth. He spoke less in class, but when he spoke, his words carried a weight that made other students listen more closely, and they did. The new respect did not soften the bullies into friends or erase the bruises of the past, but it redefined what those bruises could teach: resilience, patience, the art of choosing when to fight and when to wait, the knowledge that real power lives in protecting others and yourself without becoming what you hate. And in this lesson, the quiet student who had once believed that peace meant invisibility found a sense of belonging that did not require him to vanish. He had stood his ground, earned his dignity, and learned to navigate a world that could be cruel without being crueler in return. The ending holds a promise and a warning, a victory that does not celebrate the harm that came before, but honors the courage it took to endure and the mercy it takes to spare the last finishing blow, leaving room for forgiveness, for growth, and for the future to prove that justice in its truest form is a recipe for healing as much as for retribution. Quincy's path had not demanded revenge as an end, only as a means to return balance to a life that had long deserved a chance to breathe again. And in that quiet breath lay the story's final truth. Resilience is not the absence of fear, but the discipline to rise above it, and standing up for oneself is not an invitation to cruelty, but a promise to protect what is tender and true in us all.